Good afternoon, everyone. I am Provost and Executive Vice President Ben Vincent, and it is my pleasure to welcome all of you to the second annual Think Showcase. When the Think Showcase kicked off last year, we had a vision, and that was to highlight the outstanding work of our accomplished faculty and to engage our community in the process. And now here we are, just a year later, with more than 200 registered participants hailing from 27 states and graduates representing classes between 1954 and 2027. This is absolutely amazing. Now, I fully believe that we can only go up from here. And as many of you know, Case Western Reserve is highly invested in the next generation of healthcare. Our respected schools of medicine, nursing, dental medicine, and social work are definitely a testament to that. Now, further exemplifying that commitment is our world-class health education campus, which brings students together to learn with and from each other. But our commitment extends even further, so much so that we've made it a part of our strategic vision going forward. So to me, there's no doubt. Case Western Reserve University is a high-impact, comprehensive research institution, but we constantly aspire to do more. We aspire to become an institution that has greater and greater interdisciplinary impact. We are hoping to achieve greater social impact and to elevate inquiry at the intersection of humanity and technology. All of this while enhancing our campus culture. We also want to be better neighbors, and that extends to the healthcare outcomes of our community. We want to help reduce rates of infant mortality, opioid abuse, hypertension, and other negative health indicators in Cleveland and in East Cleveland. We strive to help decrease poverty, inequality, and environmental threats. And we also hope to be on the cutting edge of new medical innovations using technology such as artificial intelligence, the Internet of Things, augmented reality, virtual reality, and all of this while remembering the human being at the center of all of our decisions. So over the course of this program, you're going to learn a bit more about some of these and other innovations that are taking place right here on our campus. Now, if you like what you hear tonight, I'm going to encourage all of you to register for other talks that are going to be taking place as part of the Think Showcase series. Tomorrow, you're going to be hearing from President Eric Kaler, who is going to provide you with an update on the status of the university, as well as a little bit later, a panel on the social determinants of health. And then on Friday, please join us for a panel on the social determinants of cancer and community engagement. And we're also going to have a performance by our own music students. None of you are going to want to miss this, so please register and check in. I want to thank everyone for being here, for your interest in the next generation of health and in climate change and its relationship to health. It's now my absolute pleasure to introduce today's moderator, Dean of the College of Arts and Sciences, Dr. Joy K. Ward. Dr. Ward is an internationally recognized academic leader. She's also a scientist in the field of biology with experience that spans the globe. Her studies on how plants respond to changing atmospheric conditions have greatly increased our understanding of climate change on plants. She received her bachelor's degree from the Penn State University and earned her doctorate at Duke University. She also has held a postdoctoral position at the University of Utah. Prior to becoming dean at the College of Arts and Sciences, she was an award-winning professor and scholar at the University of Kansas, where she resided for 17 years. Dr. Ward is a champion of the liberal arts and sciences. If any of you have the chance to meet her, you will instantly feel her passion for the work of the arts and sciences. She believes that the college is the heartbeat of our institution. She's also a strong believer in collaboration, openness, and transparency. These are traits that she amply displays day in and day out. When I had the pleasure of announcing Dr. Ward as our new dean just over 2 years ago, wow, time flies, 2 words came to mind: optimism and excitement. And that's exactly what she's brought to the College of Arts and Sciences and to Case Western Reserve University. It's now my pleasure to hand it over to the Dean of the College of Arts and Sciences, Dr. Joy K. Ward. Please take it away.
Thank you, Provost Vinson. It is an honor to work with you every day, and I appreciate that very, very kind introduction. Thank you so much. It's a pleasure to be here today to moderate our discussion this afternoon, Climate Change in Health. Welcome to all of our university community who have joined us today, and especially our alumni and friends of the university. We are so glad that you are here today. This afternoon's topic will provide fascinating insight and perspectives into how climate change is impacting both our health and our healthcare systems. We will hear from each of our distinguished panelists before moving to a question and answer session nearer to the end of the session. For those of you who would like to ask a question, please send an email to thinkshowcase@case.edu. I'll say that again, thinkshowcase@case.edu, and I will raise questions as time allows. I would like to now turn our attention to our distinguished faculty who have joined us today. Dr. Ashwini Sehgal is a kidney specialist at Metro Health Medical Center, the Duncan Newhouser Professor of Community Health Improvement at Case Western Reserve, and co-director of the Center for Reducing Health Disparities. Dr. Sehgal is currently teaching a graduate course on climate change and health. Dr. Mary T. Quinn Griffin is the Associate Dean for Global Affairs and the Mary L. Wycool Endowed Professor at the Francis Payne Bolton School of Nursing. She is also the Assistant Provost for Outcome Assessment and Accreditation at Case Western Reserve University. Dr. Quinn Griffin is leading the climate change and health initiatives in the School of Nursing and is developing new research and education programs. She has a master's degree in education from Trinity College, the University of Dublin, Ireland, and earned her master's in nursing science and PhD in nursing from Case Western Reserve University. In 2019, she received the Elizabeth Russell Belford Excellence Award for Excellence in Education from Sigma Theta Tau, the International Nursing Honor Society. Dr. Borju Gurkin is a faculty member in chemical and biomolecular engineering. Her research aims to develop safer electrolytes for energy storage devices and materials for new carbon capture technologies. She is the Scilog Fellow on Negative Emission Science and a thrust leader in BES, the Breakthrough Electrolytes for Energy Storage Group, as Energy Frontier Research Center of the Department of Energy, led by Case Western Reserve University. Dr. Gurkin serves as the Chair of Transport and Energy Processes Division of the American Institute of Chemical Engineers. Jonathan Adler is the inaugural Johann Verheij Memorial Professor of Law and the founding director of the Coleman P. Burke Center for Environmental Law at the Law School. The author or editor of 7 books, Professor Adler is one of the most cited law professors in the country in the fields of environmental and administrative law. His work on climate law and policy has appeared in publications ranging from the Harvard Environmental Law Review and Environmental Law Reported to the Bulwark and the Los Angeles Times. Thank you all for sharing your valuable time and knowledge with us here this afternoon. It's going to prove to be a very exciting and interesting session. Professor Sehgal, would you like to begin our discussion by talking about your research as it relates to climate change health?
So I'd like to start by showing this diagram that illustrates how that illustrates the connection between climate change and health impacts. So we'll start at the left side of this diagram. So when we burn fossil fuels, essentially what we're doing is we're taking carbon that's buried under the ground in the form of coal, oil, or natural gas, and releasing it as carbon dioxide into the atmosphere. The result of this is that the carbon dioxide concentration in the atmosphere has increased from 280 parts per million to 413 parts per million over the last couple of hundred years. So almost about a 50% increase. Now, carbon dioxide acts as a greenhouse gas. In other words, the higher the carbon dioxide level in the atmosphere, the more solar energy is retained at the Earth's surface. So the result of this is that there has been an increase in the surface temperature of the Earth of about 2 degrees Fahrenheit. Now, that might not seem like a lot, but that's an average increase. There are certain parts of the Earth that have had even higher increases. So, for example, there's been several places in the last year that it reached a surface temperature of 130 degrees, including in California. And the predictions are that this surface temperature will continue to increase over the next decade at least. Next slide. And so because of the increase in the Earth's surface temperature, there's climate change occurs, and there's 4 main climate hazards associated with these changes. The increase in the Earth's surface results in problems with heat. The increase in the Earth's surface temperature also leads to wildfires and more air pollution. The increased temperature also increases evaporation of water, and in some places that leads to storms and floods. In other places that leads to droughts. Now, these 4 climate hazards have multiple health impacts. Heat results in dehydration and kidney disease. Wildfires and air pollution result in asthma, which you wouldn't be surprised to hear about, but it turns out that air pollution is also linked very strongly with heart disease and death. Storms and floods result in injury, death, and adverse effects on mental health. And droughts can lead to food shortages and infectious diseases. So this is an overview of how fossil fuel consumption and climate change have multiple health impacts. We can end the slides, and then I'll answer Dean Ward's question about my own research. I am a kidney specialist, and I'm especially interested in what happens to patients who have kidney failure. It turns out that there are about 600,000 Americans who receive regular hemodialysis treatment for kidney failure. I recently completed a study to estimate carbon dioxide emissions that result from hemodialysis treatment. I did this by separately estimating emissions from all the things that are involved in providing hemodialysis treatment, things like electricity, natural gas, water, supplies, transportation, as well as generation of waste products. And I found that the emissions, or the carbon dioxide emissions from a typical hemodialysis facility, are equivalent to the emissions from 93 homes. And the emissions per hemodialysis treatment are equivalent to driving an average automobile 150 miles. So basically what that says is that hemodialysis results in very large amounts of greenhouse gas emissions. But what I found also that was even more surprising and maybe more important is that the size of the emissions varied threefold across the facilities. And so what that means is that there are some facilities that are much more efficient than others in terms of the greenhouse gas emissions. And that provides us an opportunity to reduce greenhouse gas emissions. If we could learn what the more efficient facilities are doing, then we could use that as a model for the less efficient facilities and drive down greenhouse gas emissions. To sum up this research, the large emissions related to hemodialysis treatment are a challenge because they contribute to climate change, but the variation across the facilities presents us with potential opportunities to reduce these emissions. So with that, I'll turn it back over to Dean Ward.
Thank you. That was fascinating to learn from you about the emissions that come from medical procedures. That's something I had not thought about before. And then another point that I thought was interesting was the warming that you described with respect to the emissions of CO2, and also to point out that that warming is not uniform across the planet. We know that it's much higher at the poles than the equator. So something to watch, that the impacts of this warming might be more pronounced depending on where you live, I think is another point you really brought out that could be brought out from your point. So thank you very much. Really fascinating work that you're doing. I'd like now to turn to Professor Quinn Griffin to hear how your work has related to climate change and health issues.
Thank you very much, Dr. Ward. The US Department of Health and Human Services considers climate change to be one of the top public health challenges. Our nursing organizations also recognize climate change as a major threat to the global population, and that the nursing profession has a huge role in educating individuals and communities about the effects of this significant threat to human health and caring for those impacted by climate change. As nurses comprise about 60% of health professionals globally, their involvement in education and response to climate change is critical for the efforts to mitigate the impact of climate change on health. Nursing leadership globally has recognized that nurses must be at the forefront of addressing the impact of climate change on health. Here at the Francis Payne Bolton School of Nursing, globally recognized for its leadership, we are preparing nurse leaders to lead climate change and health initiatives. Inclusion of climate change content in nursing education is critical to ensure that nurses are prepared to understand and lead climate change efforts. One suitable framework to guide the integration of climate change content into nursing curricula is the American Association of the Colleges of Nursing's core competencies. Using this framework, our nursing faculty are designing curricular content to educate nursing students about climate change and the impact they can make to population health. Now to talk about nurses' roles in climate change and health. Nurses can assume roles to address climate change using three strategies: mitigation, adaptation, and resilience. Mitigation relates to efforts to reduce greenhouse gas emissions. Nurses can be thoughtful in the use of supplies, especially those that may impact climate. Adaptation refers to assessing and managing the impact of climate change on individuals. Nurses can teach individuals adaptation strategies related to their healthcare needs. Nurses' roles in climate resilience includes facilitating organization and engagement in policies that strengthen our communities to withstand climate change. I wish to share some exciting initiatives happening at the School of Nursing. A certificate program in climate change and health is in development. We are collaborating with faculty at the medical school to have common coursework as well as specific courses within each school. We have a new professional development program on climate change and health, where we are inviting global thought leaders in the field to share their expertise with us. Last year, we were excited to join the Nurses Climate Challenge, a national campaign to mobilize nurses to educate 50,000 health professionals on the impacts of climate change on health. Climate change is also an issue about which our nursing students are passionate about, and they have started the conversation within their association. With regard to research and climate change, we are administering a national survey about awareness and behaviours related to climate change and health. The National Institute of Health has recently established a climate change and health initiative. This new initiative will provide many of our nurse scientists with opportunities to integrate climate science into new and existing research proposals. Just to highlight a couple of faculty and their research areas that align to this new initiative. Both Dr. Valerie Tolley and Dr. Carolyn Sills have funded NIH research on resourcefulness and resilience in defined populations that are greatly impacted by climate change. Dr. Tolley in children and Dr. Sills in vulnerable minority populations. Climate change will have a major impact on human health for decades, and nurses will have a critical role in climate change initiatives. We at the Francis Payne Bolton School of Nursing are determined to lead climate change initiatives globally and in our own community. Thank you. Now I'll turn it back to Dr. Ward.
Thank you, Professor Gwen Griffin. It was really exciting to see how the School of Nursing is leading these efforts and the concern that they have and the fact that they're addressing that from the curriculum and beyond. So thank you for those great thoughts on your leadership role. At this point, I'm going to turn it over to Professor Gherkin to talk about how your research has interfaced with climate change issues.
Hello, I'm really happy to be on the panel today because I think the panel itself kind of shows what kind of an interdisciplinary research that we are doing. And Professor Segal showed all the different boxes that leads to, the consequences of climate change and health. And my research is really focusing on that carbon dioxide capture box. So we develop materials for carbon dioxide removal from cabin air and directly from the atmosphere in my group, while the removal of exhaled carbon dioxide in spacecraft is needed for the health of astronauts and enable long exploration missions in space. Removal of carbon dioxide from the atmosphere is required in order to prevent continued temperature rise on Earth. So we've already heard about carbon dioxide being a greenhouse gas emission and trapping heat on the Earth's atmosphere. More than 60% of United States electricity comes from fossil fuel burning, therefore capturing carbon dioxide from large emission sources such as power plants is critical in the short term. However, this strategy alone is not sufficient to prevent climate change. And this is why we are working on direct air capture, which is one of the negative emission science technologies. Specifically in this area, we need better performing materials, and we need to have more renewable energy sources to regenerate these materials for continued use. I think that's one of the ironies in this field. In order to develop a new technology that removes carbon dioxide either from fossil fuel burning, emissions, flue gas, or directly from the atmosphere, your technology will require some sort of energy source. And the question is, where is that energy source going to come from? Ideally, you don't want it to come from more fossil fuel burning. And so that also requires an enormous growth in renewable energy sources. And I mentioned, removal of carbon dioxide from spacecrafts. So I think this is really a fun project in my group. The conditions of the space and Earth's atmosphere are wildly different. In space, there is no gravity and there are limited energy resources. So these strict conditions forces us to rethink materials design and technology approaches. This is really what my group does. We develop materials specifically for space and also specifically here on Earth. And, again, thinking about direct air capture and we heard that the temperature rise is different in different locations. So just like that, the technologies that we should think about and design should function at different parts of the world. And they have different conditions, right? Different temperature, different climate, different humidity levels. So all of those factors are the kind of things that we do our research on. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Professor Gherkin. And now I'd like to turn the same question to Professor Adler, please.
Great. So over at the law school, as you might expect, we tend to focus on the law and policy of climate change, both what the law does or could do in terms of helping us mitigate climate change, help us reduce the likelihood or degree of climate change that we can expect in the future, as well as how the law affects our ability to adapt to climate change, because some amount of climate change is at this point unavoidable, and legal rules can certainly affect the ability of institutions and to respond to those changes and to do so in a way that can at least try to minimize the effects on health. In terms of mitigation, we know that generally what we're concerned about is reduction in emissions, reduction in carbon emissions, or perhaps other means of taking carbon out of the atmosphere. And this has a lot of effects on public health beyond the effects on health from climate change. As a general matter, if we're reducing emissions by reducing the use of various fossil energy sources, coal in particular, we are also reducing emissions of other pollutants, which have certainly been linked to a wide range of health effects. Similarly, from a legal standpoint, or I should say, one thing that's also important from a legal standpoint is that much of the federal government's regulatory authority to deal with climate change actually comes through portions of the Clean Air Act that are focused on emissions of other pollutants. So in fact, just this week, the federal government announced some additional steps that will be taken to control emissions of mercury from power plants. And that comes from controlling coal use, which also has significant effects on climate change, in addition to the health effects from reducing mercury and then reducing other emissions that come from coal. And so over at the law school, we've done quite a few programs, and my own research has looked a fair amount at how do we understand what legal tools are available at present to deal with climate change and to deal with the emissions that cause climate change and contribute to climate change, but also how to understand some of the trade-offs between some of those tools. Are some tools more effective? Are some tools more legally resilient? Are some tools more resilient to legal challenge? And just a super quick plug, on February 24th, we're actually having a forum that will be a webcast like this on a Supreme Court case that will be heard at the end of the month, concerning a challenge to the Environmental Protection Agency's authority to regulate greenhouse gas emissions from power plants, which is certainly one of the most significant contributors to greenhouse gas emissions. We've also done some programs looking on the adaptation side, looking at how it is that various legal rules both make it possible to adapt to climate change, but also how various legal rules affect the extent to which institutions bear the costs of climate change. So we see this in the financial sector, where there's an active debate today on the extent to which financial institutions should have to disclose and report on the various economic risks that are a consequence of both climate change itself and potential climate change policies, as well as more mundane questions about what do cities do to deal with climate change and the effects that that is going to place on infrastructure and place on the sorts of investments and actions that cities have to take. And as I've mentioned, we've done programs on all these subjects that are available on the Burke Center's website. And certainly, if I'm allowed to promote them, I would encourage folks to check them out and the programs we're doing in the future. And with that, I'll turn it back to you, Joy.
Thank you, Professor Adler. Really fascinating work. In my field, for example, in plant biology, there's been a lot of funding for studying plant responses to climate change, because these are very direct effects of climate change on plants, for example. But I'd like to begin the question session by reaching out to Professor Segal and asking, how has the funding been when you're trying to combine climate change work with the medical sciences? Has it been a straightforward path to getting funded, or are there challenges along the way? What have been your experiences?
Yeah, so the largest source of funds for health research is from the National Institutes of Health, or NIH. And I actually wrote a paper recently where I reviewed NIH funding for climate change. I found that only about 1% of total NIH funding is devoted to the health impacts of climate change. So right now, there's not very much funding available for research on the health impacts of climate change. I'm hopeful that's going to change in the near future, because as the health impacts become even more apparent, because we urgently need to do research to understand, to reduce, and to prepare for the health impacts of climate change.
I'm glad you said that. There are many concerns, and you listed some fascinating ones in your list, as well as even food quality changing. We know that as carbon dioxide rises, the carbohydrate levels versus protein in food is changing. So even from a nutrition perspective, this could have some effects. So all of these areas certainly impact medical sciences very directly. So thanks for that insight into the funding streams for this kind of work. Professor Quinn Griffin, speaking more from a nursing point of view, I was really struck by how many different areas you as leaders in nursing are taking for perspectives on this. How can nurses lead the way to create sustainable, climate smart hospitals and health systems? How can you be the ones that, as nurses often are, that are leading the charge on something so important?
Wow, thank you for that interesting question. All nurses, as you have just mentioned, and particularly nurse leaders, have major roles to play as they represent the largest group of healthcare workers globally. We know that the healthcare system, the healthcare sector, has a significant climate impact as they are producing nearly 10% of the total greenhouse gas emissions in the US alone. So examples where nurse leaders can help to sustain climate smart hospitals could be reducing that total greenhouse gas emission by reduce, reuse, and recycle initiatives and identifying and using energy efficient products in their work. For example, we know that nationwide, hospitals are generating an estimated 6,000 tons of waste per day, and this includes medical waste. So education around waste and recycling is a major challenge in healthcare settings. So nursing leadership can lead healthcare systems in the development and sustainment of education campaigns showing nurses and all healthcare professionals to have some know where to throw the waste campaigns. So teaching individuals to use the correct bins and codes for waste disposal sounds a very simple thing, but it has a big impact on climate change, especially when, you know, health professionals put things in the wrong bin because they're not sure exactly where they go. We know there's a lot of waste, particularly medical waste, in the operating room. So we need to educate our operating teams about the different types of waste. Again, this is an area where nurses can lead with that reduce, reuse, and recycle initiatives. Another area where the nurses can provide leadership is that nurses, they need to be part of hospital sustainability teams so that they can make a positive impact on climate change and human health through resource conservation, green procurement, and sustainable design. Nurses are the largest group working in hospitals. So it makes sense that they are involved in the design of healthy buildings and ensuring that there is cutting edge technology, providing energy efficient heat and light, as well as ensuring that there is adequate green space and tree canopies to reduce the climate change effects. A third area where nurses can provide leadership in developing the healthy hospital systems is to have roles in developing policies and procedures to ensure that there are healthy environments within the hospital. And nurses should also be involved in health policy development related to climate change. Thank you.
Thanks so much. And I was relating back to sort of the research question as well. Is the National Institute of Nursing Research engaged in this and on your side of things, or not as much of a priority for them?
Well, I think that, you know, like all of the NIH centers and institutes that now they have come forward with this new climate change initiative. I think to date, the NIH the Nursing Research Institute along with NIH has been more focused on environmental factors as opposed to factors that are directly related to climate change.
Okay, thank you. Very helpful. Professor Gerken, you bring a perspective to this subject. It's different from some of the others, and based on what you've shared, can you talk about your students or others working in the field and what skill sets and training they may be to help us manage this incredible societal challenge of climate change, or what might be prospect jobs for those graduates? I'm sure there will be a large area for them moving forward. Could you speak on that, Professor Gerken, please?
Yes, so I have a chemical engineering degree. So this is ideal for engineers and all kinds of engineers. I wouldn't just limit to chemical engineers. We often collaborate with material scientists or mechanical engineers. I have undergraduates, even from biology department, who are really interested in this kind of research. So I think, as I mentioned, it is quite interdisciplinary. Just developing the capture technology alone is quite interdisciplinary. So I think, if you have any interest, if you care about climate change, I think you have a role in this. I encourage anyone who is interested, don't think that, oh, I have, this major and maybe it's, not for me. It's definitely a global issue and a lot of people can contribute to it.
Thank you very much. I think that gives our future students some areas that they can focus on if they want to get involved in this work. And we certainly need the talent of the next generation to help us with this major challenge. I also have a question for Professor Adler. The Supreme Court will hear oral arguments in a climate change related case coming up on February 28th. Can you talk about that issue specifically?
Sure, happy to. And as I mentioned, we're having a program on the 24th that will preview that argument. Basically, one of the largest sources of greenhouse gas emissions in the United States is our power sector. Generating energy often results in the emissions of greenhouse gases. Certainly here in Ohio, that's true with the amount of coal-fired utilities that we have, but it's also true with other sources of electricity. And both the Obama administration and the Trump administration adopted radically different approaches to controlling greenhouse gas emissions from the power sector. The Obama administration adopted something called the Clean Power Plan, which was designed to encourage utilities to think more broadly about energy production and think about the full range of energy production and how in that broader system, energy can be produced in a way that reduces greenhouse gas emissions. The Trump administration interpreted the Clean Air Act in a far narrower way, basically saying if you can install some sort of technology at a power plant to reduce emissions in a cost-effective way, great, but otherwise you shouldn't have to consider things like fuel switching or other changes within electricity systems to reduce emissions. A lower court basically upheld the Obama administration approach and rejected the Trump administration approach. And the Supreme Court is going to hear oral arguments in a case on that question at the end of the month. And at stake is both at a narrow level, what the Biden administration might try to do or might be able to do in terms of controlling power plant emissions of greenhouse gases, but it may have broader implications for the extent to which the Environmental Protection Agency and other federal agencies can use environmental statutes that were, for the most part, enacted in the 1970s, focused on that generation's set of environmental problems, and use those authorities today in the 21st century for issues like climate change that are more front and center today. And so the case both has significant implications for the narrow question of controlling greenhouse gas emissions from the power sector and potentially broader implications for how our existing environmental laws can be used to deal with contemporary problems.
Thank you. Very interesting area. And also I want to follow up with one further question, Professor Adler. Climate change is so interesting in the sense that what one nation may do can highly impact another. And as I mentioned before, communities that, for example, that are at the poles are having more warming than other communities. And those communities are often adapted to the cold. They rely on it for their well-being. As we move forward, what international agencies might assume responsibility for billing countries that are having a higher influence on this? And how do we do that when we think about the fact that we might add to climate change by making goods that are exported? How do we balance all of that such that we need to tax those or bill those for causing these changes? I know it's a very large international question, but I was curious if you had thoughts on that.
There are lots of challenging issues buried into that question. And one of the things that makes climate change such a difficult problem is that we are dealing with an environmental problem that manifests itself at a global scale. It's one planet, we have one atmosphere, but also it's a particularly challenging problem because the parts of the world like the United States that have historically contributed the most to increasing greenhouse gas emissions are also the parts of the world that in many respects are the least vulnerable. It tends to be poorer countries and less developed countries that have both contributed less to the problem, but also are more vulnerable to the various impacts, including health impacts, that climate change is going to visit on the world. And so that makes it challenging. And at the international law level, things have to be done through agreement, through coming to the table and negotiating over terms. There is not an international entity that has the ability to impose restrictions on the United States or impose restrictions on Europe or China and so on. And so that combination makes it very challenging. I mean, certainly looking at history, and this last point on this, if you look at prior international environmental agreements, one thing that often facilitates those agreements is the work of folks like Professor Gherkin that reduce the costs of meeting our environmental goals. If we look at, for example, the phase out of chlorofluorocarbons under the Montreal Protocol, agreement in that context was dramatically accelerated once we knew what would replace CFCs to meet refrigeration and related needs. Similarly, the more progress we make in finding ways of meeting the world's demand for electricity in a low carbon way, the easier it will be to come to the table and reach the sorts of agreements that will allow both for mitigating climate change, but also helping those parts of the world that are most vulnerable insulate and protect themselves from the degree of climate change that's in many respects inevitable.
Very complicated. Thank you for that. And then I have one last question I'd like to broaden out to the group, probably most focused on our medical professors. Some studies came out recently showing differences in canopy cover, and Professor Quinn Griffin mentioned this, that in some communities, particularly communities that had higher economic means, there was very strong canopy cover by trees. The energy requirements of those communities were lower because it was cooler, because of the large older trees that were costly, but that were managing the temperature of a community, versus very nearby communities that did not have tree cover, for example, and had 5 to 10 degrees Fahrenheit warmer conditions on any given day than other communities. This is certainly going to interact to affect the health of those communities. And it's just one very simple, small example of disparities that climate change can impact even in communities that are very close together. They can have different impacts. And do any of you have solutions for how we might reach out to those communities and make some changes such that we're reducing and hopefully at some point in time eliminating these disparities on how climate change can interact with health and well-being? If one of our professors in the medical area or others would like to take a stab at that, I'd love to hear your thoughts.
Yeah, I can start with that one. So there was a study recently which found that neighborhoods in Cleveland and in other large cities that were redlined in the 1930s have very different tree canopies now. So neighborhoods that were redlined have very minimal tree canopies. Neighborhoods that were not redlined have much more robust tree canopies. And as Dr. Ward said, that can make a difference of several degrees in the summertime temperature under those canopies, actually as much as a 13-degree difference. So I think that with respect to that particular problem, what we need to do is to build up our tree canopies everywhere, because trees everywhere are going to be good for everyone. But we especially need to build up in the tree canopies in neighborhoods where they've been allowed to deteriorate over the years. And certainly anytime we're building a new road like the Opportunity Corridor, we should make sure that there are plans for building robust tree canopies as part of that new construction.
Thank you for your thoughts. Dr. Quinn Griffin.
I would certainly agree with what Dr. Segal has just said. I think that we need to develop policies and have education programs to educate our communities. I am not sure if communities and individuals really understand the importance of the tree canopy. And It would be great if there was a policy that if a tree was felled for some reason, that it had to be replaced. I see even in my own neighborhood that the number of trees has been reduced over the years. So just making sure that the community are aware and that there is a deliberate policy to replenish trees as they grow older, and then for us to have perhaps sponsor tree initiatives in some of these poorer neighborhoods, so as to help develop the tree canopy. I think there are a lot of green people out there that would be very willing to be involved in these initiatives, but perhaps they don't know how to get involved or the implications and the impact it has on the health of the community. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Very interesting ideas and responses there. And that is our time for this afternoon. This has been a fascinating discussion, and I hope everyone watching today has learned and gained new insights into this important topic. It's a really critical area for us to think about, and I appreciate all of your questions that you sent in. I want to thank each of our panelists for your research and your leadership that have brought us here today and sharing in this very important topic. And I appreciate your high level of expertise in these areas. And thank you to all of you for watching today via live stream. Your engagement is vital to the university community. And there are 2 more programs coming up this week in the 2022 Think Showcase series. Social Determinants of Health will be held Wednesday, February 2nd at 6:00 p.m. It will include a university update from President Eric Kaler. Social Determinants in Cancer will be held Friday, February 4th at 4 p.m., immediately followed by a musical performance by Case Western Reserve University student musicians, which I'm so very proud of. Please join them for that session. And details and registrations are available at case.edu/events/Think Showcase. Thank you for joining us this afternoon, and I hope you all have a wonderful evening. Take care and be safe. Thank you.